Did you know that fantasy has like a bajillion subgenres? Maybe you want to get into writing fantasy and you don't know where to start. Or maybe you've actually finished your manuscript and you're getting your queries ready, and then you realize that you don't actually know what subgenre your book falls under. Maybe you were under the impression that you were writing high fantasy this whole time when it's actually a sword and sorcery. These distinctions are important to understand, especially when it comes time to publish your book. So I thought I'd make a video about some of the fantasy subgenres that exist and what makes them different from each other. If you're new here, my name is Brianna and I post videos every Sunday that help you become a better writer. I also make easy to use writing workbooks that help you build and outline your novel from start to finish. So if you're interested, check them out in my Etsy shop Planner Palette Co, linked in the description below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. I get it. You see fantasy on the shelf and you think dragons, magic, chosen ones, throw it all in a blender and call it a day, right? But the fantasy genre isn't just one big umbrella where anything magical fits underneath it. It's actually a carefully structured hierarchy of subgenres, each with their own distinct rules, expectations, and reader demographics. And if you don't understand which subgenre your book belongs to, it could almost be like trying to sell an epic space opera to fantasy romance readers. So today we're going to break down the fantasy spectrum from the most grounded to the most otherworldly so that you can understand where your story fits and, more importantly, how to leverage that knowledge to make your fantasy irresistible to the right audience and the right agent. I'll just note though that I won't be talking about romantasy or fantasy romance, as I've already made videos on both of these, which you can watch after this, and I feel like these genres are popular enough right now that most of the general reading community knows what it's about. So let's start with low fantasy. It's not low because it's inferior, it's low because the fantasy elements are minimal and grounded in our real recognizable world. This is where magical elements intrude into the primary world, our Earth, our reality, where magic traditionally doesn't belong. Think Twilight's vampires living in small town America. The magic is intrusive, meaning it's breaking into a world where magic doesn't traditionally exist. The contrast here is where low fantasy really shines. When you put a werewolf in downtown Chicago or a witch in a modern high school, that juxtaposition creates instant tension. Readers don't need extensive world building here because they already understand the baseline reality. Now, low fantasy does not mean lazy world building. Low fantasy actually requires very careful world building because you have to explain how magic fits into a world of cell phones, social media, and government surveillance. How do vampires avoid security cameras? How do wizards file taxes? These subsurface questions matter even if they don't make a physical presence within your story. Now we step up to high fantasy, and this is where usually a lot of confusion starts. High fantasy has one defining characteristic, which is that it takes place in another world. Not Earth, not an alternate version of Earth, a completely fictional world with its own geography, history, cultures, physics, and rules. Middle Earth, Westeros, Roshar. These are all entirely invented worlds that exist outside of our reality. But high fantasy doesn't automatically mean an epic scope or world-saving stakes. And this is often what new writers misunderstand. You can write a small, intimate story about a baker's daughter discovering she has magical powers in a secondary world, and it's still high fantasy. The high refers to the level of fantasy elements and world creation, not the scale of the conflict. That's because high fantasy is defined by setting, not scope. The moment your story takes place in a world that isn't Earth, regardless of whether your protagonist is saving the world or just trying to pass magic school, you're writing high fantasy. And this is where I see writers make their biggest mistake. They create a secondary world but then populate it with medieval European culture, standard fantasy races, or magic systems that we've seen hundreds of times before. If you're building a new world, make it truly unique. Now let's talk about epic fantasy. Here's where things get massive, and this is what most people think high fantasy actually is. Epic fantasy is about scale, temporal, geographical, stakes-wise. We're talking about stories that span multiple books, multiple countries or continents, and even multiple generations. Epic fantasy is characterized by world-threatening conflicts. The Dark Lord is rising. Ancient evils are awakening. The prophesied chosen one must fulfill their destiny. The fate of the entire civilization hangs in the balance. The Lord of the Rings is a great example of this, as is A Song of Ice and Fire and The Wheel of Time. These are doorstop books with ensemble casts, where the scope is so massive that individual character arcs often span multiple books. Now, epic fantasy is almost always high fantasy too, because stories of this scope usually require secondary worlds to contain them. But epic fantasy isn't big for the sake of being big. Every element, the large cast, the complex politics, the multiple plot lines, they serve the central theme, usually good versus evil or order versus chaos, on a cosmic scale. One key thing to remember though when writing epic fantasy is that It doesn't just mean longer. Don't pad your story with unnecessary subplots and characters because you think that's what epic fantasy requires. It should be epic because the story demands that scope, not just because you're trying to hit a word count. Now, low, high, and epic fantasy are the three most common fantasy subgenres that you probably already knew of, but it's still easy to mix them up, especially if you're just starting out in the genre. But now let's talk about some of fantasy's other subgenres that usually have a smaller presence in bookstores, but their impact is anything but. Sword and sorcery is a subgenre that most writers tend to overlook when they're writing a fantasy story, which is a shame because I feel like it's one of the most underrated fantasy subgenres for modern audiences. Sword and sorcery takes place in secondary worlds, just like high fantasy, but the stakes are personal, not cosmic. Instead of saving the world, our heroes are trying to save themselves, or maybe their friends, or they're just trying to get rich. Think Conan the Barbarian or Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. These are episodic adventures where morally gray protagonists fight supernatural threats for personal gain. The scope is smaller, the pace is faster, and the moral complexity is much more interesting than your typical good versus evil. The key difference between sword and sorcery and other secondary world fantasy is motivation and scope. In high fantasy, characters might be on noble quests. In epic fantasy, they're saving the world or fulfilling destinies. In sword and sorcery, they're trying to make a living, get revenge, or simply live to see another day. I really like this subgenre because modern sword and sorcery has evolved to the point where it has more diverse protagonists, more complex world building, and stories that blend the personal stakes action of classic sword and sorcery with contemporary sensibilities about character development and social issues. Sword and sorcery gives you all the benefits of secondary world fantasy, so you get complete creative control over the setting without the pressure of epic scope. You can write tight, focused stories that are easier to plot and more manageable, especially for debut authors. Dark fantasy is where things get psychologically complex. This subgenre can take place on either Earth or a secondary world because it's defined by its tones and its themes. It blends fantasy elements with horror themes and uses magic and supernatural elements to explore the darker side of human nature. But dark fantasy isn't just fantasy with more violence. It's fantasy that uses the supernatural to examine themes like corruption, moral ambiguity, psychological trauma, and the cost of power. The magic comes with a price, and that price is usually steep. Think the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, or the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence. These are stories where the traditional fantasy heroes are either absent or corrupted, and the magic systems often reflect the moral complexity of the world. What makes dark fantasy shine is its willingness to subvert fantasy tropes. The chosen one might be a sociopath. The magic system might be fueled by suffering. The happy ending might be a lie. It's fantasy for readers who want their comfort food served with a side of existential dread. Now, sci-fi fantasy is one of my favorite subgenres, and it's the current subgenre of the book that I'm currently working on. Science fantasy, or sci-fi fantasy, is a careful blend of fantasy and science fiction elements, where both the magical and the technological aspects are integral to the story. Think Star Wars, because Star Wars is technically science fantasy, not just science fiction. You have advanced technology like lightsabers and hyperdrives, but you also have the Force, which is essentially magic. The story couldn't work without both elements. Now, I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, so correct me if I'm wrong that the Force doesn't have some sort of scientific or technological explanation for it, but as far as I know, it's magic. Warhammer 40,000 is considered science fantasy. The Dying Earth series by Jack Vance is science fantasy. Science fantasy gives writers incredible freedom because you can blend the unlimited possibilities of both genres. Want dragons that have survived to evolve in space? Go for it. Magic-powered starships? Absolutely. Ancient wizards who achieved immortality through technology? Let's do it. Let's now talk about urban fantasy as well as contemporary fantasy, because many writers assume that it's interchangeable and they're actually different subgenres with different reader expectations. Contemporary fantasy is any fantasy set in the modern world. It can be urban, suburban, or rural. The key is that it's happening now in recognizable settings. That's why it's called contemporary, because contemporary means as of the current time, which is the present that we live in now. Urban fantasy, however, specifically requires an urban setting and usually has a grittier, darker tone. It often includes crime elements, noir atmosphere, and tends to feature supernatural creatures like vampires, werewolves, or fae integrated into city life. Now, understanding this distinction matters because urban fantasy readers expect a certain tone and style. They want their magic served with attitude and often with a side of romantic tension. Contemporary fantasy readers might be looking for something more gentler and more adjacent to magical realism. So where does your story actually belong? A lot of writers are trying to write epic fantasy when their story is actually high fantasy with personal stakes. Or they think they're writing urban fantasy when they're actually writing contemporary fantasy with supernatural elements. The subgenre you choose affects everything: your target audience, your word count expectations, your world building elements, even your marketing approach. An agent looking for the next Game of Thrones isn't going to be interested in your sword and sorcery adventure, no matter how well written it is. Not only that, but knowing what subgenre your book belongs to can help you flex some creative freedom within those boundaries. When you know that epic fantasy readers expect certain things, you can give them those things in unexpected ways. When you understand that dark fantasy has specific tone expectations, you can meet those expectations while bringing your own unique voice to the subgenre. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, you might want to watch this one next. Don't forget to like and subscribe to become a better writer, and I'd love to read in the comments what genres or subgenres you like to write in. Until the next chapter.